What is inflation and why is it 1,000 times worse than what you realize? First, inflation is the decreased buying power of your dollar. Remember when you could go to the grocery store and buy 4 candy bars for a single dollar? And now you can't even buy one for less than $1? In other words, you can no longer buy as much as you once did with the exact same amount. Why is this even happening? I'm no economist, but when we have countries that print trillions of dollars that aren't backed to pay for programs we can't really afford, the value of that respective currency will go down. If the value of the currency is down, the prices will have to inevitably go up in order to keep up with the same amount of value that they were getting before. A company can perpetually continue to get record profits every single year without really increasing the value that they are getting. Despite technically getting record sales, they're stagnant. Don't get me wrong, corporate greed can be an issue. And on the surface, corporate greed can be easy to blame for the inflation. Companies are built to make money, so they raise the cost to make even more. So there, mystery solved. Sadly, it's not that simple. For example, let's say we have a bridge. There's people at the bottom of the bridge. There are people at the top of the bridge that are throwing rocks or boulders down to the water to make as big as much splashes as they can. We are the bystanders by the water. We often get splashed and suffer the consequences of those rocks being thrown. The economy and the companies are the water. So who is to blame? Those throwing the rocks? The water flowing down its path? Or the idiots by the water? But who's throwing the rocks? We have the policymakers and we have the Federal Reserve, or what's known as the Fed. It is the Fed's job to, and I quote, "The Federal Reserve has a dual mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices for the American people." Oversimplifying this analogy, the policymakers and upholders determine the size of the rock or boulder that is to be thrown. The Fed determines how high or low to make the bridge to help maximize employment and stabilize the prices, to help keep us dry given the boulder sizes being thrown and the current economic status. I don't envy their job and its complexity. They change rates at which the banks and large entities can borrow money in order to try to keep inflation as close to 2% as they can. 2% is their stated goal. And if you have excellent credit, you can borrow from the bank, like for a house, typically at a rate just slightly worse than what the bank gets it from them, as the banks have to make a profit as well. But how is inflation calculated? There are two different price indices that are mostly used. There's the Consumer Price Index, which normally shows a higher inflation rate, and there's the Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index that the Fed typically uses and typically shows a more favorable rate of inflation. Sadly, I couldn't find the exact formulas that they use, so if any of you guys do have that or have a link to it, please put it in the comments below, and I'd like to look at it and be able to see, because I often think that inflation is often a lot higher than what they like to claim. So why is inflation bad? One, it's an unspoken tax on your current money, and it's a hidden tax when you spend your current money. I'll explain this in a couple examples to follow. Two, Social Security, which sadly way too many people rely on solely for their income, is adjusted on the less favorable inflation index. And three, it seems to be very recurrent that inflation is always higher than what our salaries and our incomes are adjusted to. And over time, these unspoken taxes continue to add up and compound on each other. They try to claim to keep inflation close to 2% as possible, and on their site, they pretty much state that they do pretty good doing what they claim to be doing, but they also claim that inflation was only at its worst at 7.2% during COVID. So I'll leave that to you there if you believe them. I don't buy it. I think it's higher. It's also why I want to see the formula on how they calculate it. But let's look at two different scenarios. Let's have Brian again, and we'll have George. In both cases, we'll say they saved $10,000. For Brian, the Fed was able to keep the inflation rate at a steady 3% per year. And after 30 years, that buying power of that $10,000 went all the way down to $4,010, pretty much a 60% drop. Let's say for George, the Fed had inflation steady at 3% for 5 years, but then for 2 years it was at 8%. And it was consistently like that for a steady 30 years. So after this 30 years, George is now down to the buying power of $2,626. Almost 75% of its value or intrinsic worth is gone, compared to 60% from Brian. So this is the unspoken tax of your current savings. On top of this, let's say each of them wants to buy something that for today costs $100. How much would it cost 30 years from now? And let's say that there's no more added corporate greed to this. It would cost Brian $243 to buy that $100 item, and it would cost George $355 to buy that $100 item. So inflation isn't a victimless offense. And it isn't just an additional tax to the wealthy or savings. It affects us common folk as well. So what am I arguing should be done about this? Personally, I don't think we should make any policies that aren't sustainable and that wouldn't put our children and grandchildren in a better situation and position than we currently are now. We need to stop the behaviors of paying Peter by robbing Paul. And if the policies that we're making today might, put a Band-Aid on our wound today, but make it worse for our grandchildren, we need to stop that and not pass that. 2, we need to make this dollar strong again. We need to stop printing off money recklessly, and we need to stop spending more than what we bring in. And along the same lines, number 3, we need to make a plan and figure out how to pay down our national debt. I remember when I was a kid that they were talking about how the national defense spending was way too much. And now our interest on our debt alone is almost the same amount as our national defense spending. Soak that in for a bit. We need to pay down that debt. And finally, the U.S. is strong, especially with the ingenuity and creativity of its people. As long as the companies continue to greatly thrive, this rock is just kept on getting kicked down the road. But we are far from being invincible to these problems and to these errors. And we just have to look at the history of other countries to see that these practices aren't sustainable. So what are your thoughts? Please let me know in the comments. And if you've made this far, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Until next time, ciao.